Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dissenter Weekly for October 22nd, 2020. I'm Kevin Costola, managing editor for shadowproof.com. And I want to remind you before we get to this week's show to hit the red subscribe button below this video to follow our show. And remember that Shadowproof is a 100% reader-funded and supported website. Our ability to do the show depends on your financial support. So anything you can do to help keep this show going, we greatly appreciate it. Thank you. And now I have a special show. Normally, I would use this to go through several stories from the past week related to whistleblowers. I provide an update on WikiLeaks, but because it's the 10th anniversary of the Iraq war logs, I wanted to do a show focused on that. So I have a really special guest joining me to talk about this. But first, just a quick intro. The Iraq war logs published by WikiLeaks revealed 15,000 civilian deaths that were previously unknown. They also exposed torture that the United States military instructed officers to ignore. WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange said when he was speaking during a press conference, in our release of these 400,000 documents about the Iraq war, the intimate detail of that war from the U.S. perspective, he hoped to correct some of the attacks on the truth that occurred before the war, during the war, and which had continued on since the war officially concluded. The stated aims for going into that war of improving the human rights situation, improving the rule of law, did not eventuate, Assange added. In terms of raw numbers of people arbitrarily killed, that worsened the situation in Iraq. 10 years after their release, Assange is in Belmarsh prison in London and faces an extradition request from the U.S. government on charges that he violated the Espionage Act when he engaged in this journalism. Of course, there are other charges and there are other materials that he's being criminalized for being involved in publishing. My guest is Marjorie Cohn, professor of law at the, let's bring her in first. Here we go. My guest is Marjorie Cohn, professor of law at the Thomas Jefferson School of Law and former president of the National Lawyers Guild. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
If we're exact, the Iraq war logs appeared around 5 p.m. Eastern, so just a bit from now. That was 10 years ago. Assange, Kristen Harafson, who is now the editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, John Sloboda of Iraq Body Count, who testified during the extradition trial, was part of a press conference, and Phil Shiner of Public Interest Lawyers, and Gavin McFadden, who unfortunately is no longer with us. He was viewed as the godfather of WikiLeaks and was part of that press conference on October 23rd. And they outlined some of the details, and it was quite a partnership. This was reporting that was done with The Guardian, Der Spiegel in Germany, Sveriges Television in Sweden, Le Monde, Al Jazeera, Channel 4, and BBC Radio were all outlets that were given access and had prepared coverage of this material. So as part of our conversation to kick this off, how do you view the release of the Iraq war logs and why are they still important 10 years later?
Well, the Iraq body count people say that still, even after 10 years, the war logs remain the only source of information regarding the nearly thousands of violent civilian deaths in Iraq between 2004 and 2009. And Daniel Ellsberg, perhaps the most famous whistleblower, who revealed and published or leaked the Pentagon Papers in 1971 to the New York Times, and that helped to end the Vietnam War. Daniel Ellsberg testified at Julian Assange's extradition hearing and said that what WikiLeaks did in releasing the Iraq war logs and the Afghan war logs and the Guantanamo files, etc., was on par with what Daniel Ellsberg did. And there's a real commonality there because both Daniel Ellsberg and WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, co-founder of WikiLeaks, were vilified and prosecuted. Actually, Assange hasn't been prosecuted yet, but Trump is trying to prosecute him for revealing war crimes. That's really what we need to keep squarely in mind. When we talk about WikiLeaks and we talk about Assange, what Julian Assange is facing, if he is extradited to the United States for trial on the indictment, is 175 years for revealing U.S. war crimes. And the Obama administration refused to bring Assange to trial. They investigated it, and I'm sure you've said on your show, Kevin, that Obama prosecuted more whistleblowers, had an unprecedented number of prosecutions of whistleblowers. But even the Obama administration knew that they could not prosecute Julian Assange without also prosecuting the New York Times, the Washington Post, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, El País, other media outlets that had done the same thing that WikiLeaks did.
Yeah, that's correct. That even Barack Obama's administration, their Justice Department, knew that they could go up to the line, but they couldn't cross it. And I want to get into what's in the indictment specifically as it relates to the Iraq war logs. But let me first ask you, this revelation that I most remember from the Iraq war logs that stayed with me is that there was an order, Frago 242, that essentially said to the officers that were deployed there that the higher ups were not going to be investigating any evidence of torture that was engaged in by the Iraq police forces or the Iraq security forces. And that basically, because of that, we see in these war logs that they documented them, they acknowledged that abuse allegations were made, but that they weren't going to take any further action. Am I right that was pretty explosive and remains to this day because of the impunity we've seen around torture?
Well, it is. The U.S. military made a political, I think, decision not to investigate allegations of torture and abuse by Iraqi forces if they didn't directly involve Americans. But one of the things that the Iraq war logs revealed was that American interrogators actually threatened detainees with torture by Iraqi forces if they didn't talk. So there was a lot of work hand in glove between the U.S. military and the Iraqi forces. And one of the things I think is very important, Kevin, and something that is not given enough attention, I don't think, is that Obama proudly took credit for ending U.S. military involvement in Iraq. But he had tried for months to extend the December 31st, 2011 deadline that George W. Bush had negotiated with the Iraqi government. And negotiations between Obama and the Iraqi government broke down when Iraq refused to grant criminal and civil immunity to U.S. troops. In other words, if U.S. troops stayed in an advisory capacity, helping to train, etc., that if they committed crimes or were suspected of committing crimes or civil wrongs, that they would be immune. And after seeing the evidence that WikiLeaks leaked and published, such as those in the collateral murder video, which I'm sure we'll talk about, and the Iraq war logs, the Iraqi government refused to give immunity to U.S. soldiers against criminal and civil liability. And I was at a conference in 2011. I was at a conference in Vienna, a human rights conference, and I spoke with Tariq Agrawi, who was Iraq's ambassador to Austria and the UN representative from Iraq in Vienna. And he told me that if they granted immunity to Americans, they would have to do the same for other countries as well. And so actually, the revelations in the Iraq war logs, particularly the evidence of torture by Iraqi forces, actually saved lives because Obama had to withdraw troops, because once the Iraqis saw that evidence in the war logs, they refused to grant immunity to U.S. troops. That's very significant.
Yeah. And as you're mentioning, there was this squad that was invoked by U.S. soldiers. I want to say it was called the Wolf Brigade. And we know from The Guardian that this was basically an attempt to reemploy elements of Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard. And these were people who wore red berets, sunglasses, and balaclavas, and they drive out on these raids in Toyota Land Cruisers. That's how The Guardian described them. And they were accused of beating prisoners, torturing them with electric drills, sometimes engaging in summary executions. This is what's in the Iraq war logs. But, unfortunately, I think we are 10 years later. It'd be fair to say that a lot of people out there are not very familiar with these contents, and primarily so. We get to the one propaganda line that came out from U.S. government officials that lives were put at risk. In fact, if you go to, I just put together a report marking this anniversary. If you look at an example of the war log in there, you'll find this at shadowproof.com. If you look at an example, or you might be familiar with this, Marjorie, if you look, there are actually X's and there are characters that show redactions. These Iraq war logs were significantly censored in order to protect the identities of all kinds of individuals that were involved or possibly implicated in these reports. There was great care taken by WikiLeaks as well as Iraq body count. And this was also testimony that we heard during the extradition trial. I don't know if you want to respond to any of that aspect of this.
Yes, there was testimony from a former employee of Der Spiegel who worked very closely with Julian Assange and other media outlets. And he said that Assange was adamant that names should be redacted to protect U.S. informants in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And he was very, very strict. One of the things that came out at the extradition hearing continually is how, on the part of the government, were accusations that Julian Assange put informants at risk by publishing their identities. And in fact, there was testimony by more than one witness that Assange was very, very careful to redact names and use encryption to protect those identities. But I also want to just give listeners a little bit more of a sense of the torture and abuse that was documented by WikiLeaks. And these are Iraqi detainees being tortured and abused by Iraqi detainees with the support and backup of the U.S. government, using electrocution, electric drills, sometimes executing detainees, raping them, shackling them, blindfolding them, hanging them by the wrists, and cutting off a detainee's fingers and burning him with acid, doing some kind of abdominal surgery to do with the kidneys, not really clear what it was. So I think it's important when we're talking about torture and abuse to make it real. What are we talking about? What did Iraqis do with the support of the U.S. government, particularly the Bush administration, and why Daniel Ellsberg testified that these revelations by WikiLeaks and Julian Assange were so critical to expose the war crimes and indeed to end U.S. involvement in Iraq. That's really important, I think.
And then, of course, we also must highlight the kind of violence that took place at these checkpoints in which people were expected to somehow survive despite the fact that they were getting mixed hand signals from soldiers at times. Soldiers could be quite fearful. They couldn't see inside the vehicles, or that's what they would claim in retrospect after incidents happened. Patrick Coburn, the Middle East correspondent who's done exceptional work covering Iraq in the last couple of decades, provided testimony at the extradition trial. He highlighted a couple examples from the war logs that show these incidents that are basically the bulk of the deaths inside of the war logs, which you're seeing 1 to 3 people die at any given time. And it was made clear that these kinds of incidents are the kind that the media often do not report because they're not mass casualty events. This is just daily life for people in a war zone.
Yes, that's true. And I think that's what caught the attention of Chelsea Manning, who actually provided and leaked these documents to WikiLeaks. And at her guilty plea proceeding, she was 22 years old, private first class, then Bradley Manning, before she gave classified documents to WikiLeaks. And she was facing 20 years, and she pled guilty to charges that actually, ultimately, she was sentenced to 35 years before Obama, as he was leaving office, commuted her sentence, and that incensed Donald Trump, and that kind of drew his attention to Julian Assange. But at her guilty plea hearing, her military tribunal, Chelsea Manning said, and I'm quoting her, "I believed if the public, particularly the American public, could see this, it could spark a debate on the military and our foreign policy in general as it applied to Iraq and Afghanistan. It might cause society to reconsider the need to engage in counterterrorism while ignoring the human situation of the people we engaged with every day." And Manning was frustrated by her inability to convince her chain of command to investigate the collateral murder video and other what she called war porn that was documented in the files that she provided to WikiLeaks. She was disturbed by the response to injured children and bothered by the soldiers depicted in the collateral murder video who seem not to value human life by referring to their targets as dead bastards. And I don't know if you want to get into the collateral murder video, but this is perhaps the most notorious thing that was leaked in terms of people seeing it, hearing about it. I've seen it many times, and every time it just makes my blood boil, where an American Apache helicopter, U.S. Army helicopter, fired on unarmed civilians in Baghdad in 2007, killing 18 people, wounding 2 children. And then if that wasn't enough, and targeting civilians violates the Geneva Conventions, that's considered to be a war crime. And if that wasn't enough, then when people came to rescue the wounded who had not yet died, the Apache helicopter fired on the rescuers, a second war crime, a violation of the Geneva Conventions. And the third war crime is that a U.S. military jeep drove over one of the dead bodies, basically cutting it in half, defacing a dead body, which violates the U.S. Army Field Manual. And so this is something that really caught the attention of Chelsea Manning, in addition to the untold numbers of civilian deaths that the U.S. military had not copped to before, the torture, the abuse, the rape. And so she actually turned this information over to WikiLeaks in an act of conscience. She tried to go up her chain of command. She tried to go through the channels, and it fell on deaf ears. And as Daniel Ellsberg has said so eloquently, she is a hero. Chelsea Manning is a hero. And so is Julian Assange for getting this information out to a wide public audience through all of these media outlets. And for that, of course, he is being prosecuted. And the reason that his case is so important is because it really drives a dagger straight into the heart of the First Amendment freedom of the press and the right of journalists to publish classified information, which they've been doing for years, even information that has been wrongfully procured, they've been doing for years. And as the Obama administration determined, if Julian Assange is prosecuted, that has vast ramifications for all of the media outlets that did the same thing and that will be deterred from doing that in the future. What Julian Assange's prosecution is doing, or will do if he is prosecuted, if he is extradited to the United States, is to chill journalists from reporting information that's critical of the government. That's why Trump is so set on going after Julian Assange. And if the U.S. is granted extradition, and the judge before whom the matter is pending in London has granted extradition in 96% of the cases that have come before her, after the various levels of appeal, and including to the European Court of Human Rights, if Julian Assange is ultimately extradited, assuming he survives because he's in very frail physical and mental health, he would be subject to torture. There was a lot of expert testimony at his extradition hearing by prison authorities, by wardens, by people who are familiar with the prison system and the supermax prisons in the United States. He would, in all likelihood, be sent to the highest security maximum supermax prison, held in a cell the size of a parking space for 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, which amounts to torture, and subjected to special administrative measures that actually could end up killing him. Several psychiatrists testified that he was a suicide risk because of his history of emotional and mental problems. So this is really serious. And the fact that the corporate media has pretty much ignored it, ignored Julian Assange's case, ignored the Iraq war logs today on the 10th anniversary is really criminal in and of itself.
Yeah, and let me say that Chelsea is someone who I found her grand jury resistance when she was subpoenaed to testify, and obviously they were setting her up to testify against Julian Assange. I found her resistance in the fact that she was able to hold out for a year astounding, and incredible and amazing. Another act of courage beyond what she had already done, and a tremendous sacrifice. I can tell from following the extradition trial closely in this prosecution that it tremendously frustrated the prosecutors that they were not able to get something out of her that they could use against Julian Assange for this case yet. And so I am glad that you raised those details about the collateral murder video, because anyone who paid any loose attention to this would notice that the collateral murder video does not come up during the case against Julian Assange. It's because the U.S. government is afraid of it, because they know that what is in that video is indefensible, even more indefensible than the other contents of these disclosures, apparently. So I want to turn to the indictment and ask you, along the lines of the law and the press freedom questions here, I'd like to refer to what is in the indictment, particularly about these war logs, because we're defending the right of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks to publish this material. And it refers to this password cracking agreement and says prior to it, Manning had already provided WikiLeaks with hundreds of thousands of documents classified up to the secret level that she downloaded from departments and agencies of the United States, including the Afghanistan war-related significant activity reports and Iraq war-related significant activity reports. At the time he entered into this agreement, Assange knew, and I think this is really crucial for me to have you comment on, Assange knew, understood, and fully anticipated that Manning was taking and illegally providing WikiLeaks with classified records containing national defense information of the United States that she was obtaining from classified databases. Assange was knowingly receiving such classified records from Manning for the purpose of publicly disclosing them on the WikiLeaks website. So I want to get your comment here, because they're essentially saying if you know that your source has broken the law, you're not allowed to publish information, which is not how I understand the First Amendment.
That's not true. That's not true. And Chelsea Manning has consistently maintained that no one at WikiLeaks asked or encouraged her to give them the documents. She said, no one associated with the WikiLeaks organization pressured me to give them more information. The decision to give documents to WikiLeaks was mine alone. Now, the Trump administration knows that it is getting tremendous flack for allegedly going after journalism and journalists. And so in order to get around allegations that it's prosecuting Assange for conducting journalism, the Trump administration is trying to paint him as a hacker by accusing him of conspiring with Manning to break into a government computer to steal government documents in violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. But Patrick Eller, a digital forensic expert, testified at Assange's extradition hearing that the attempted cracking of the password hash was not technologically possible. in 2010 when the conversation between Assange and Manning occurred. And even if it were feasible, the purpose would not have been to conceal Manning's identity, and it would not have given Manning any increased access to government databases. So this was a very strong defense to that hacking charge, which doesn't carry the same penalty that the charges under the Espionage Act do. But the fact that they put that in there to try to dilute or get around the other allegations which go to the heart of the practice of journalism shows that they are conscious that their case is not all that strong.
Well, in fact, the computer crime allegations include language from the Espionage Act. So to me, it was never really a strong and convincing way of sidestepping those issues of press freedom, because they were actually still using Espionage Act language against Julian Assange. So to end, I'd like to ask you to address the larger context. We have a Trump administration that has prosecuted Julian Assange, or to be exact, has indicted and is trying to extradite him to the United States, took this step. And as you mentioned, Barack Obama's administration did not take this step. But one thing that was alarming and laid out very clearly by Julian Assange's legal team in London was that WikiLeaks exposed torture, WikiLeaks exposed war crimes related to drones. There was a rendition and torture survivor, Khaled El-Masri, who was a victim of a CIA kidnapping, provided testimony during the trial. And we had this connected to the International Criminal Court and the way in which the Trump administration is sanctioning people who are trying to investigate war crimes in Afghanistan. And I think when you look at that, what's happening to the International Criminal Court, and you look at Assange's case, there's a lot that needs to be said about what the U.S. is doing.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's important, the point you raise about the International Criminal Court, and this came out through Clive Stafford Smith's testimony, who represents a number of current Guantanamo detainees. And he said that the exposure, the WikiLeaks exposure, actually has led to criminal liability on U.S. leaders. And he was talking, I think, largely about the International Criminal Court, where the prosecutor recommended to the pretrial chamber that they open an investigation of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed not just by Taliban and Afghan forces in Afghanistan, but by U.S. military leaders as well. Now, the Trump administration pressured the International Criminal Court, threatened sanctions, withdrew the visa of the prosecutor, the ICC prosecutor, to come to the U.S. But nevertheless, the appeals chamber of the International Criminal Court, in a really courageous move, reversed the pretrial chamber and said, no, we're going to open a full investigation with arrests, subpoena power, etc., of not just Taliban leaders, but U.S. leaders as well. And now the Trump administration is mounting a full court press against the ICC with all kinds of sanctions against personnel directly or indirectly connected with this case, or any case that investigates the U.S. very close ally Israel, and really trying to weaken the court, the International Criminal Court, and throw mud at it. But so far, the court is standing firm, and we'll see what happens with that. But that's a very, very significant byproduct of what WikiLeaks and Julian Assange revealed and what Chelsea Manning leaked to them.
I had my mic muted. Sorry for that. Thank you very much for joining the show. I appreciated being able to talk with you. And of course, you've been a good voice on this case. So I encourage people to, to follow your work as it pops up in the progressive media. And people see you on Democracy Now! So thank you again for joining.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
All right. And for everyone watching the show, we'll be back next week with another episode. And until then, if you would like to get regular reports in your inbox, you can go to dissenter.substack.com, dissenter.substack.com, and also get videos for this show on a weekly basis. So thank you. We'll be back next week.